August 17, 1943. Over central Germany, 376 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses were crossing the border in broad daylight. 230 had been sent toward Schweinfurt, deep in the industrial heart of the Reich. Another 146 were peeling south toward Regensburg. Together they formed a sky full of metal and contrails that stretched from horizon to horizon. The men of the German Jagdwaffe, the day fighter arm, were already airborne, scrambled from bases across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. They had altitude, they had speed, they had numbers. In every conventional sense, they had the advantage. And yet what followed that morning was not a clean victory. German pilots who pressed their attacks suffered losses that defied easy explanation. Men who should have dominated the encounter broke off their firing runs before reaching effective range. Others closed to firing distance, fired briefly, and peeled away into the clouds below. When the day ended, 60 American bombers had been destroyed, but so had roughly 27 German fighters, with around 16 pilots killed. And in the weeks and months that followed, as the raids grew deeper and the numbers grew larger, a pattern hardened across the Jagdwaffe that no order, threat, or decoration could arrest. Germany's finest pilots, men with dozens or hundreds of victories, were avoiding American bombers even when they had the advantage. Understanding why that happened is understanding something essential about how the air war over Europe was really decided. The Boeing B-17 flying fortress had been designed to answer a question that preoccupied American air power theorists throughout the 1930s. Could a heavy bomber defend itself in daylight without fighter escort? The theory was not unreasonable for its era. A large aircraft flying high and fast, armed with multiple heavy machine guns at carefully chosen positions, operating in tight formation with similarly armed aircraft, would theoretically produce a wall of defensive fire that enemy fighters could not penetrate without catastrophic losses. The United States Army Air Forces believed this so deeply that they built an entire strategic doctrine around it and committed thousands of lives to proving it. The B-17F, the primary variant flying the Schweinfurt missions, carried between 11 and 13 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, the exact number depending on field modifications carried out at bases in England. These guns were positioned in nose sockets, staggered waist openings along the fuselage, a powered dorsal turret above the cockpit, a powered ball turret beneath the belly, and a twin mount at the tail. The B-17G, which entered combat with the 8th Air Force in November of 1943, standardized the arrangement at 13 guns and added a powered chin turret directly under the nose. That chin turret was a direct response to a weakness German pilots had already found and were systematically exploiting. The B-24 Liberator, the other major American heavy bomber over Germany, carried between 10 and 12 guns depending on the variant, and similarly added a powered nose turret in its later production marks. A single bomber armed in this way was formidable. But the real power of the American bombing campaign was not the firepower of any one aircraft. It was the geometric multiplication that happened when dozens of aircraft flew in the precise arrangement known as the combat box. Colonel Curtis LeMay developed this formation while commanding the 305th Bomb Group at Royal Air Force Grafton Underwood in England. He debuted it operationally on December 6, 1942, on a mission to the locomotive works at Lille in occupied France. His group flew in a tight, staggered, three-dimensional arrangement instead of the loose V formations used by other groups. They suffered 0 losses that day, while other groups operating that same mission lost aircraft. Other commanders took notice. By the following spring, the combat box had become standard practice across the 8th Air Force. LeMay moved on to command the 4th Bombardment Wing, and then, when the newly constituted 3rd Bombardment Division was activated on September 13, 1943, he moved up to command that larger formation as well, bringing his tactical ideas to an ever wider scale. By the summer of 1943, 3 group boxes were being stacked into a combat wing formation, roughly 3,000 feet tall, 7,000 feet deep, and 2,000 feet wide. A fully assembled combat wing of 54 aircraft could field approximately 750 caliber machine guns with overlapping fields of fire. LeMay had arranged each group's bombers in a stepped, interlocking pattern so that the defensive guns of each aircraft covered the blind spots of its neighbors. No single attack angle offered a clean approach to any individual bomber without simultaneously entering the fire arcs of multiple surrounding aircraft. It was not a collection of individual planes. It was a single coordinated weapons system built from aluminum and men. The Pulk's geometry also solved a problem that individual gunners had never been able to crack on their own. A fighter attacking from the high rear right of a bomber was an ideal target for that aircraft's dorsal turret, a reasonable target for the right waist gun, and a difficult target for the tail guns. From a formation, however, that same fighter was simultaneously an ideal target for the dorsal turret of the bomber directly ahead, an ideal target for the left waist gun of the bomber to its right, and a primary target for the tail guns of the aircraft above. The attacker was not entering the fire envelope of one aircraft optimized for his angle. He was entering the optimized fire envelope of 3 or 4 aircraft at once, every one of which had been placed in that specific position precisely because of his approach profile. LeMay had designed this the way an engineer designs a system, not the way a tactician designs a plan. The Germans called it the Polk, meaning the herd or the pack. The word carried a weight that is easy to underestimate. German fighter pilots had trained for individual aerial combat, the turning dogfight, the pursuit, the clean encounter with a recognizable beginning and end. The Polk offered none of that. It was a moving wall of interlocking fire, suspended over Germany at altitude, day after day, advancing toward the factories and refineries and transport hubs that Germany needed to survive. The men inside those formations were not abstractions. They were mostly in their early 20s, from Ohio, Texas, Pennsylvania, and California, who had crossed an ocean to climb into aluminum airframes at -30°C and fly toward targets that wanted to kill them. 10 men flew each bomber. A pilot, a co-pilot, a bombardier, a navigator, a radio operator, 2 waist gunners, a ball turret gunner, a tail gunner, and a top turret gunner. Breaking out of formation for any reason, battle damage, mechanical failure, a navigational mistake, meant flying alone over Germany, and flying alone over Germany in 1943 almost certainly meant not going home. The men on those missions lived with statistics they were not supposed to discuss. A tour of duty in the 8th Air Force in the autumn of 1943 required 25 completed missions. Mathematical studies circulating quietly among aircrew calculated the probability of surviving a full tour at somewhere below 25%, depending on the raid. Some bomb groups, those assigned to the low squadron position the men called Purple Heart Corner, lost aircraft so regularly that the rotation of crews into those slots was a known sentence. Every man on those aircraft knew what the escort boundary meant. They had watched what happened to the groups that flew beyond it without protection. Some had flown those missions themselves. They climbed in and flew them again anyway, and the particular courage of men who understand the odds and continue regardless is something that deserves to be named clearly, rather than dissolved into abstraction. The British Royal Air Force had already paid a terrible price to learn the cost of daylight unescorted bombing. In the summer of 1941, the RAF sent Bristol Blenheim and Wellington medium bombers on daylight precision raids against targets in occupied Europe and suffered losses so severe that the effort was abandoned within months. The RAF switched to night bombing, accepting degraded accuracy as the cost of survival. The Americans, convinced that their heavily armed and tightly formed bombers could succeed where the British had failed, began their own daylight campaign in the summer of 1942. The early raids against targets in France and the Low Countries produced painful but manageable losses. The real test came when the bombers pushed past the escort boundary and into Germany itself. The strategic framework that placed these forces against each other was formalized in June of 1943 through the Point-Blank Directive, which assigned the American 8th Air Force to daylight precision bombing of German war industry, while the RAF continued its night campaign against German cities. The two campaigns were designed to create around-the-clock pressure that German industry and population could not absorb indefinitely. The Americans believed that destroying specific industries in daylight, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, synthetic oil refineries, would collapse German war capacity faster and with less civilian loss than the British approach. They held to that belief even as the loss rates climbed, because the alternative was to admit that the doctrine on which they had staked their strategic contribution to the war was wrong, and the price of admitting that would be paid by thousands of men who had already been sent to prove it right. The critical weakness was range. In the autumn of 1943, no American fighter could escort the bombers all the way to their targets and return. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary escort fighter of that period, could reach into the fringes of Western Germany and then had to reverse course for fuel. Beyond that turning point, the bombers flew alone. The German fighter arm had been positioning itself at that boundary since the first deep American penetration. On the morning of August 17, 1943, at airfields from Belgium to the Rhine, German pilots received their scramble orders with the particular calculation that came from experience. The radar plots showed hundreds of aircraft assembling over England. The size of the raid meant a deep penetration. The escorts would eventually turn back. The German veterans among those pilots were identifiable by the way they moved through the morning routine, unhurried, precise, their hands steady as they completed their walk-around inspections and discussed engine sounds with their mechanics. The newer men, the ones with 60 or 80 hours of total flying time who had arrived at their units in the past few weeks, had a different quality. They asked too many questions, or none at all. The experienced men who rose to meet those bombers carried within them the weight of 4 years of continuous combat. They had been in action since September of 1939. They had flown over Poland, France, Britain, and the Eastern Front before the Americans came. They had survived everything the war offered through a process that was entirely impersonal and entirely brutal. They knew what combat cost, and they knew from the summer of 1942 onward that the American bomber stream was a different kind of problem. When the Polk appeared, it did not resemble the photographs in the recognition manuals. It looked like a city suspended in the sky, moving with slow and deliberate purpose, trailing contrails for kilometers behind it. It looked like something designed specifically to be impossible to attack without dying. A Focke-Wulf 190 approaching the rear of a B-17 formation closed at approximately 270 meters per second. At that speed, the window in which a pilot could acquire a target, establish a firing solution, and release a burst at effective range was under 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which he was simultaneously exposed to the tail guns, waist guns, ball turret, and portions of the dorsal turret of his target aircraft, plus the overlapping fire from every surrounding bomber that had an angle on his approach. The tracer fire from that volume of weapons, arriving from different distances and different angles, could not be flown around. It could only be flown through. The tracers were visible long before effective range. A pilot could watch them converging on his approach path from hundreds of meters out. This was not a coincidence of ballistics. It was a psychological instrument as powerful as any mechanical weapon on the aircraft. The tracer fire made the geometry visible before the point of no return. It showed the approaching pilot exactly what he was flying into. Veterans with hundreds of combat hours could override that information through accumulated discipline. Newer pilots, who had not yet built the emotional conditioning that turns fear into controlled action, could not. They broke off. Karl Boris, commanding the 1st Gruppe of the 26th Jagdgeschwader, described flying an attack against the box in terms that survived in his unit's war diary. Tracer rounds swarmed around his cockpit like wasps before he could reach his firing position. He recorded that pilots following in trail would inevitably break away before reaching effective range, passing through the formation at whatever angle seemed to offer the best chance of survival, with no coherent attack on any specific target. Coordinated approaches that required multiple aircraft to hold formation through the full closing distance were nearly impossible to sustain once the tracer streams began converging around the lead pilot. The fighter pilot who broke off short of effective range was also, in many cases, the only man with enough experience to understand precisely why he was breaking off. A pilot with 300 hours could read the coverage geometry in the seconds of the approach. He could calculate that the angle he had chosen would put him in the concentrated fire of 4 or 5 aircraft simultaneously at the moment he reached optimal range, and that his probability of surviving that exposure was low. A pilot with 80 hours had not yet built the visual processing that allowed that calculation. He broke off because the tracers were frightening, which is a different thing entirely. That difference, between the man who could quantify what he was facing and the man who could only feel it, is part of why veterans' accounts of the Polk are so precise and so consistent across units and across years. They knew exactly what they were looking at. Boris could press. The men behind him often could not. And that distinction, between the pilot who could close to effective range and the pilot who could not, was the mechanism destroying the Luftwaffe from within. The Luftwaffe attempted several technical solutions to the problem of attacking a formation defended by hundreds of simultaneous machine guns. The most promising was the Werfer Granit 21, a 210mm spin-stabilized rocket that could be fired from rails beneath the wings of a Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109 at ranges of roughly 1,200 meters, well outside the effective reach of the bomber's 50-caliber guns. Each fighter typically carried one under each wing. The rocket was inaccurate and dramatically reduced the carrier aircraft's speed and maneuverability, but it allowed a pilot to fire at the formation from a distance where the return fire could not reach him, and a hit or near miss could break individual bombers out of the defensive geometry and expose them to conventional gun attacks. The weapon was introduced in the summer of 1943 and showed genuine promise against unescorted formations. Its value disappeared the moment escort fighters appeared in the area, because a rocket-laden Focke-Wulf was slow and helpless against a single-engine fighter. Once long-range escorts arrived in force, the rocket approach was effectively abandoned. The most ingenious tactical answer the Germans produced was the head-on attack, developed by Hauptmann Egon Mayer of the 3rd Gruppe of the 2nd Jagdgeschwader on November 23, 1942. Mayer led his formation directly at the noses of B-17 and B-24 bombers attacking the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic coast of France. By coming head-on, he exploited the B-17F's weakest sector, where only a pair of handheld guns in nose sockets defended the forward approach, while the combined closing speed of the two formations compressed his exposure window to under 2 seconds. Mayer claimed 2 B-17 bombers and a B-24 that day. The 8th Air Force's own post-mission report noted that nearly all German attacks had been frontal, a tactical development it had not anticipated. The powered chin turret that Boeing standardized on the B-17G in the autumn of 1943 was the direct American answer to Mayer's innovation. The head-on attack required something most German pilots in 1943 could not reliably provide. It demanded a precise deflection shot at roughly 900 km per hour of combined closing speed, in a firing window of under 2 seconds, against a moving target, amid a formation of aircraft all executing the same maneuver simultaneously. Mayer could do it. A small group of exceptional veterans could do it. A pilot with 50 hours of total flight time could not. Mayer himself pressed those attacks with a consistency that seemed to defy the mathematics. He accumulated 102 victories entirely on the Western Front, never having served on the Eastern Front, making him uniquely a product of the campaign against Britain and then America. Each of those victories was won against opponents who were not beginners. Each of the 26 four-engine bombers in that tally was destroyed by flying into the single most dangerous approach in aerial combat, the head-on pass into a formation designed to fill exactly that approach with lead. That he did it 26 times and survived speaks to a level of skill and nerve that very few people in any era have possessed in a cockpit. That he was eventually shot down on March 2, 1944, near Montmedy in northeastern France, by American escort fighters he could not outrun, speaks to how war eventually settles accounts. The Luftwaffe's training crisis had been building since the winter of 1942-43, when transport aircraft crewed by experienced flight instructors were committed to the Stalingrad airlift and never returned to the schools. That single decision removed an irreplaceable generation of instructors from the training pipeline. Later, the Allied oil campaign, beginning in the spring of 1944, strangled what remained. German aviation fuel production fell from roughly 175,000 tons in the spring of 1944 to approximately 7,000 tons by September of that year. Aircraft that could not be fueled could not train pilots to fly them. A German fighter pilot entering combat in 1939 had between 220 and 250 flying hours. By the summer of 1943, that figure had dropped to between 160 and 180 hours. By the end of 1944, replacement pilots were arriving at frontline units with around 100 to 120 hours, roughly half the training of the American and British pilots they were sent to fight. In the final months of the war, some men reached operational units, having logged as few as 20 hours on their specific aircraft type before their first combat sortie. American fighter pilots entering combat at the same point in the war had 320 to over 400 hours. The gap was not a disadvantage. It was a death sentence, measurable in minutes from the first engagement. The Luftwaffe had built its early dominance on a training pipeline that produced genuinely expert combat pilots. That pipeline, once interrupted, could not be rebuilt while the front was actively consuming its graduates faster than any school could replace them. Each month that passed was a month in which the caliber of the men entering the cockpits dropped, and in which the caliber of the men they were flying against held steady or improved. What this meant in practical terms was not that German pilots were poor aviators. Many of them were gifted natural flyers. What it meant was that gifted natural talent, exposed to the Pulk approach before hundreds of practice hours had shaped it into reliable conditioned response, was not enough. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most decorated surviving aces, described the replacement pilots arriving in 1944 as youngsters sent to the slaughter, boys with 50 or 60 hours who could barely hold their aircraft in a coordinated turn. Pilot Heinz Noack wrote in his diary in August of 1944 that every time he closed his cockpit canopy, he felt as though he were closing the lid of his own coffin. Every day, he recorded, the number of aircraft around him diminished. The German fighter command was slowly bleeding to death. General Adolf Galland formally documented the collapse in a report to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in the summer of 1944. Between January and April of that year, Galland wrote, "The Jagdwaffe had lost more than 1,000 pilots, killed, missing and wounded, including its best squadron commanders, wing leaders, and group commanders. Each major American penetration of German airspace was costing approximately 50 aircrews. The fighter arm," Galland told Göring, "was in sight of collapse." The Luftwaffe's broader institutional problem extended beyond the individual pilot shortage. The Jagdwaffe was a force built for offensive operations, designed to clear the sky ahead of an advancing German army. Its doctrine, its training, its organizational structure, and its command culture were all shaped by the victories of 1939 to 1941. Defending the Reich against a sustained, massive industrial bombing campaign was a fundamentally different task that required different aircraft, different tactics, different training, and a different command philosophy. The twin-engine heavy fighters, the Messerschmitt 110 and its successor, the Messerschmitt 410, represented the Luftwaffe's most systematic technical answer to the problem of attacking the combat box from outside its defensive range. Armed with heavier cannon and rocket pods, they could fire at the formation from distances the bombers' guns could not reach. On the first Schweinfurt mission, the destroyer units claimed several bombers using exactly this method. But the twin-engine aircraft depended entirely on the absence of escort fighters. They could not maneuver against a single-engine opponent in any meaningful sense. As American escort coverage deepened between February and April of 1944, the Bf-110 and Me-410 units were broken in detail by fighters that had been hunting for exactly this target. The decisive blow fell on April 9th of 1944, when units of the 76th Destroyer Wing lost nearly a third of their aircraft in a single engagement over Berlin. After that day, the Messerschmitt 110 and 410 withdrew from daylight Reich defense. Germany had invested years in a weapons platform specifically designed to defeat the combat box, and it was gone before it could decide the campaign. Göring's response to all of this was to accuse his pilots of cowardice. The accusation had been growing since the summer of 1943, when reports of pilots returning with unexpended ammunition and undamaged aircraft began accumulating on his desk. He issued orders threatening courts-martial against any pilot who broke off an attack without justifiable cause. He demanded that his men press attacks to ramming distance. He declared that the Jagdwaffe lacked the fighting spirit that had carried it through the Battle of Britain. Local commanders quietly set aside the most extreme of these orders, understanding that they came from a man who had never flown into a Pulk and who was confusing courage with mathematics. But the orders themselves were their own kind of evidence. Commanders do not threaten courts-martial against pilots returning with unused ammunition unless enough pilots are doing it to constitute a systemic pattern. Göring's threats were the Luftwaffe admitting, in official language, that it could not make its men press the attack through ordinary authority alone. The institutional solution that emerged from this crisis was one of the war's most extraordinary documents. Major Hans Gunther von Kornatzky proposed the creation of a volunteer unit, flying specially armored aircraft whose pilots would sign a personal oath to press attacks on four-engine bombers to point-blank range, using ramming as a final resort if their guns failed to destroy the target. This was not symbolic language. It was a literal written commitment. Sturmstaffel 1 formed at Akmer Airfield in October of 1943. Its Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft were modified with bolted armor panels on the cockpit sides, 30mm armored side glass, and additional fuselage plating. The aircraft carried twin 30mm Mk108 cannon in the outer wings, supplemented by two 20mm guns at the wing roots. Ballistic tests had established that 4 hits from the Mk108 were sufficient to destroy a B-17. The pilots signed the Sturmverpflichtung, the assault obligation, binding each man to close to the shortest possible range and ram if his weapons proved insufficient. They were encouraged to write their wills before missions. The Sturmgruppen, as these units came to be known, could achieve devastating results under the right conditions. Those conditions required isolation. On September 27, 1944, 35B, 24, liberators of the 445th Bomb Group made a navigational error, struck the wrong city, and became separated from their fighter escort over central Germany. 3 Sturmgruppen found them. In approximately 6 minutes, 25 of those 35 bombers were shot down inside Germany. Only 4 returned to their home base at Tibbenham in Norfolk. 117 American airmen were killed. 121 became prisoners of war. It remains the greatest single mission loss suffered by any American bomb group of the entire war. But the conditions that allowed it, bombers without escorts, were becoming impossible to create. General Jimmy Doolittle's order in January of 1944, releasing American fighter pilots from close escort duty to hunt German interceptors wherever they could be found, changed the nature of the air battle immediately. Combined with the arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang in force over Germany in the early months of 1944, it placed escort fighters over the bomber stream at altitudes and ranges that had not existed before. German pilots who had been intercepting the Pulk now found themselves intercepted, before they could reach firing position, by American fighters carrying 400 hours of training and full fuel loads. Big Week, the operation conducted between February 20th and 25th of 1944, drove this point home across 6 consecutive days. The 8th Air Force flew over 3,000 heavy bomber sorties against German aircraft industry. By the estimates of historians Donald Caldwell and Richard Muller, the Luftwaffe lost roughly 260 fighters, destroyed plus approximately 100 experienced pilots killed during those 6 days alone. The month of February as a whole cost the Jagdwaffe something approaching a third of its operational single-engine fighter strength. By the time the oil campaign began in earnest that spring, what the Luftwaffe had left was not enough to absorb a replacement shortage it had been accumulating for 2 years. The specific quality of those 6 days in February was different from even the worst single-raid losses that had come before. A bomb group losing 20% of its aircraft on a single mission was a catastrophe that could eventually be rebuilt with replacements and fresh crews. 6 consecutive days of sustained attrition across the entire fighter arm, hitting experienced pilots in every unit simultaneously, was something the replacement pipeline could not address. A groupie that lost its most experienced element leaders on Monday could not replace them before Tuesday's mission. The men who knew how to lead a coordinated attack, who had learned through hard experience which approach angles were survivable and which were not, were dying faster than any training school could produce their equivalents. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force was not merely smaller than it had been. It was structurally different in a way that statistics could not fully measure, staffed increasingly by men who had not yet had the chance to fail safely and learn from it. The human cost of the entire campaign settled most heavily on the men who were hardest to replace. October 8, 1943. Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp, commander of the 1st Jagdgeschwader, 206 credited victories, was shot down west of Bremen near Nordhorn, close to the German-Dutch border, while intercepting American bombers. He had written to his friend Colonel Troutloft 4 days earlier that curving in toward 40 fortresses made all your past sins flash before your eyes, and that it became that much harder to order other men to do it once you understood that feeling yourself. He did not survive the fall from his aircraft. He was 26 years old. March 2nd, 1944. Hauptmann Egon Mayer, Commodore of the 2nd Jagdgeschwader, 102 victories, including 26 against 4-engine bombers. The man who had invented the head-on attack in November of 1942 was shot down by American escort fighters near Montmedy in northeastern France. He had spent 16 months perfecting the only tactic that gave a German pilot a reasonable chance of destroying a B-17 in a single pass. His death removed the man who understood it best. March 6, 1944. Hauptmann Hugo Frey, commander of the 7th Staffel of the 11th Jagdgeschwader, 32 victories with 26 against 4-engine aircraft. One of the most effective anti-bomber specialists in the Luftwaffe was shot down over the Dutch province of Drenthe by return fire from B-17 bombers of the 452nd Bomb Group. He had destroyed 4 of those bombers in the same engagement before the defensive fire killed him. May 11, 1944. Oberst Walter Oesau, commander of the 1st Jagdgeschwader, 127 victories accumulated over Spain, France, Britain, the Eastern Front, and the defence of the Reich, died in the Belgian Ardennes near St. Vith when his engine failed during a pursuit engagement with P-38 Lightnings of the 474th Fighter Group. Goering, in a telephone call relayed to Oesau by his duty officer in the weeks before his death, had accused him of growing tired and turning coward. The 1st Jagdgeschwader was renamed in Oesau's honour after the war. April 5, 1943. Hauptmann Fritz Geischardt, commander of the 3rd Gruppe of the 26th Jagdgeschwader, was struck by B-17 defensive fire on his very first firing pass of the engagement and managed to put his aircraft down. He bled to death in a hospital in Ghent the following morning. He was 24 years old. Each of these deaths compounded the problem of the next. When Philipp died, the 1st Jagdgeschwader lost a commander who had shaped its entire approach to the anti-bomber mission. When Mayer died, the head-on tactic lost its most credible practitioner and the pilot best positioned to pass its demands to the next generation. When Frey died, the 11th Jagdgeschwader lost a man who had compiled a record against 4-engine aircraft that took most pilots a career to approach. Each vacancy was filled by someone with less experience, and each less experienced replacement faced the same pulk that had killed the man before him. The weight of those losses accumulated in ways that no operations map could capture. A Jagdgeschwader that lost its commodore in October lost the man who set the standard for every formation leader under his command. It lost the institutional knowledge of how to press a Gruppe attack against a combat wing in a way that kept pilots alive long enough to fire effectively. It lost the specific tactical memory of what had worked and what had gotten men killed over the past year. His replacement inherited the aircraft and the pilots and the orders, but not the 1,000 hours of practiced judgment that had kept the previous man alive long enough to accumulate it. That knowledge went into the ground with the man who had built it. These men and the dozens like them were not replaceable in any meaningful time frame. Each had accumulated hundreds of hours of skill and judgment that took years to build and seconds to lose. Galland would write afterward that this was the moment the German fighter arm lost something it could not quantify on any chart. It was not a specific number of aircraft or a specific piece of airspace. It was the generation of men who had built the Jagdwaffe's identity as a fighting force, whose deaths between the summer of 1943 and the autumn of 1944 left a command structure staffed by brave men who possessed a fraction of their predecessors' accumulated knowledge, facing an enemy that was only growing stronger. The Jagdwaffe's command recognized this structural erosion even if it could not fix it. Unit commanders filed reports through the summer and autumn of 1944, describing pilots who were technically capable of flying their aircraft, but who lacked the combat judgment to execute the attack sequences their missions required. These were not failures of individual character. They were the predictable output of a training system that had been stripped of its foundation 2 years earlier and was now producing men who had the form of pilot training without the substance of it. The form could be measured in logbook hours. The substance could only be measured in the ability to press an attack through converging tracer fire at 270 meters per second without flinching, and that is not a thing that any training program produces in 100 hours. The American gunners who defended those formations were brave men doing a genuinely dangerous job, but the popular impression that they were personally destroying the Luftwaffe in large numbers needs careful examination. On August 17, 1943, 8th Air Force gunners officially claimed 288 German aircraft destroyed over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, with 37 more claimed as probably destroyed. German records document approximately 27 fighters actually destroyed in the air that day. The overclaim ratio was roughly 10-1. The mechanism was honest and unavoidable. A single Focke-Wulf 190 flashing through an 18-plane formation could be simultaneously engaged by dozens of gunners, each filing a sincere claim with no gun cameras to reconcile them afterward. This pattern recurred throughout the campaign. On October 14, 1943, over the second Schweinfurt mission, gunners claimed 186 German aircraft destroyed. German records show 31 destroyed, 12 written off, and 34 damaged. This is not a criticism of the men on those guns. It matters because it clarifies what the defensive fire was actually doing. It was not decimating the Jagdwaffe at 10-1 rates. It was making the approach dangerous and overwhelming enough to be catastrophic for the inexperienced men increasingly filling German cockpits while consuming at an unsustainable rate the small number of veterans who had the discipline to press through it regardless. Other nations that faced massed defensive fire from coordinated formations learned similar lessons. The Royal Air Force's failed daylight bombing of 1941 established the price of unescorted penetration before the Americans arrived in Europe. Japanese naval aviators pressing attacks against American carrier task forces found that the men willing to close through concentrated defensive fire were consumed faster than they could be replaced. These were not isolated failures of tactics or nerve. They were expressions of a problem without an easy solution. Attacking a position whose design purpose is to kill you for approaching it will always cost more than attacking a position that cannot shoot back. The crisis in the Jagdwaffe reached its formal expression on January 19, 1945, at a meeting in Berlin that history calls the Fighter Pilots' Revolt. A delegation of Germany's most decorated surviving Jagdwaffe commanders, with Oberst Gunther Lutzow serving as spokesman alongside Oberst Hannes Trautloft, Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, Oberst Eduard Neumann, and Oberst Gustav Rodel, confronted Göring directly. The points they raised, recorded afterward by the Chief of the General Staff Karl Koller, included a deep accumulated bitterness at the continuous charge of cowardice, a loss of confidence in the direction of operations, and unified support for General Galland, who had been relieved of command 6 days earlier. Göring threatened to have Lutzow shot for treason and accused Steinhoff of undermining the war effort. By January of 1945, he was entirely powerless to change what had already happened to his air force. No pilot was executed. Galland was eventually permitted to form a small elite unit flying the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter. The war ended 4 months later. Even in that final unit, flying the fastest combat aircraft in the world, the dynamic did not disappear. On April 26, 1945, Galland flew his last combat mission, intercepting B-26 Marauder medium bombers over southern Germany with his jet fighter unit. He admitted in his own account that he was tense during the approach, that he completed one firing pass, and that he was hit before he could evaluate his result. Post-war research established that the first hits on his Messerschmitt 262 came not from escorting American fighters, as Galland initially reported, but from the defensive fire of the B-26 bombers themselves. Then a P-47 Thunderbolt, flown by First Lieutenant James Finnegan of the 10th Fighter Squadron, 50th Fighter Group, finished the job. The man who had led the German fighter arm through its most critical years could not complete a single pass through American defensive fire in the most advanced combat aircraft Germany ever built, without being struck. The evidence of those years is still being found. Aircraft fragments surface in Dutch farmland, Belgian forest, and German pasture with no markings left to name the men who flew them. Shell casings corrode slowly in the polders of Drenthe. Museums in England, Germany, and the United States preserve what can be preserved. The American Air Museum at Duxford in Cambridgeshire holds a B-17 in the markings of a Schweinfurt-era 8th Air Force Group. The Kassel Mission Historical Society has collected the accounts of survivors from both sides of the September 27th engagement. The families who received the news in different languages, American families through War Department telegrams, German families through Heldentodt notifications, experienced something that needed no translation. Fathers, mothers, wives, and children waiting for men who did not come home. Men who had trained for years and believed in what they were doing, ending their lives in a few burning seconds over a country that was not their own. The story of why German pilots avoided American bombers, even when they had the advantage, is not a story about cowardice. The men who flew into the pulk were not cowards. The men who broke off short were not simply afraid. They were responding rationally to conditions that had been engineered, through industrial ingenuity and tactical geometry, to make pressing the attack cost more than any force could indefinitely pay. The combat box did exactly what LeMay designed it to do. It did not destroy the Luftwaffe at the rates the gunners believed. It forced every attacking pilot to choose between approaches that were either ineffective from safe distance or lethal at effective range, and it consumed at the highest possible rate the small group of men whose deaths the defense could least afford. The Sturmgruppe oath was Germany's acknowledgement that this logic had broken the normal chain of military command. When you must write a sworn contract requiring men to promise to ram enemy aircraft, you have admitted that ordinary courage, discipline, and orders are no longer sufficient. The armoured cockpit panel bolted to a Focke-Wulf 190 was not an answer to the problem. It was a monument to it, pressed in steel, carrying inside it a young man who had signed his name to something no man should have to promise. Those men flew anyway. They fought against mathematics that had become insurmountable, not because German pilots were inferior, but because one side was running out of trained men, aviation fuel, and time at exactly the same moment the other side was not. Behind the American bomber streams, across the Atlantic, factories produced aircraft and trained pilots in volumes the Jagdwaffe's exhausted remnant could not match, regardless of how hard they flew. The air war over Germany was decided not by a single battle, not by a single tactic, and not by any individual act of courage or its absence. It was decided by 2 years of asymmetric attrition that consumed, faster than anything else could have, exactly the kind of men whose loss could not be undone by any production schedule on Earth. That is the answer to the question this story began with. It is harder than the legend on either side. It is the story of what it costs to press an attack into converging tracer fire, and of how that cost, paid one irreplaceable man at a time, quietly settled the outcome of the war in the sky over Germany long before the last aircraft landed.